Welcome to Pillow Time Lore, where dreams take shape and stories wrap around you like your favorite blanket. You've made it through the day, and now it's time to slow down, breathe deeply, and drift into a world made just for you. So, fluff up your pillow, snuggle into your coziest spot, and let your eyes get heavier with each word. This is your moment. No to-do lists, no noise, just stillness and a little magic. With each breath in, feel the tension melt from your shoulders. With each breath out, let go of everything that doesn't serve your peace. You're safe here. Tonight's story is soft and soothing, like a warm cup of tea for your thoughts, carefully crafted to calm your busy mind and help you drift gently into sleep. So close your eyes, dear dreamer. Let your imagination wander while I carry you into a land where anything is possible and everything ends in peace. This is Pillow Time Lore. The river ran slow these days. It wasn't always like that once. Boats had dotted the water like floating star tourists with cameras, kids with sun hats, laughter bouncing off the ripples. Now, the only sounds were the wind nudging through tall grass and the occasional call of a heron overhead. Even the river seemed tired, like it too had grown old with the town. Nia wiped the coffee counter for the third time. Though it was already spotless, the Low Tide Café stood at the edge of the riverside road, a crooked little building with flaking green paint, string lights that only half worked, and mismatched chairs that wobbled if you weren't careful. The old neon sign flickered stubbornly, open as if willing someone, anyone, to walk in, but no one did. The morning rush had been a single customer, Mrs. Holton, who came in every Thursday for tea and a slice of lemon cake, though today she forgot her purse and promised to pay double next week. Dear Nia had smiled and waved it off, just like always at 27. Nia felt too young to be this tired, and too old to still be here. Her life had slowly narrowed into a routine she couldn't escape. Wake up before sunrise, make breakfast for her father's soft food, no salt, walk to the cafe, work until close, go home, heat soup, help him with his meds, try to sleep, repeat. The river was just across the road, but she hadn't touched its water in over a year. Her father used to be strong, a fisherman. Before the fish stopped coming, he still sat by the window every day, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the river like it might speak to him. Some days he spoke back, and still she stayed because leaving felt like betrayal, because no one else would stay. Her friends had moved to cities, started lives that weren't wrapped in fog and rust. They sent postcards, sometimes. Nia tucked them into a drawer she never opened. She ran her fingers over the smooth coffee machine, the only modern thing in the cafe. It had been her one splurge, something shiny and hopeful, like a promise she couldn't quite name. But what good was a fancy espresso when no one wanted to sit and sip it anymore? The river outside shimmered slightly as the sun broke through the overcast sky. It caught her eye, For a brief second, it looked alive again, as if it remembered how things used to. Baby bell above the door jingled. Nia turned quickly, her heart doing a little skip like it always did when someone actually came. Ina. Man stepped inside, carrying a sketch pad and looking like he didn't belong. Tall, quiet, face a little weathered, but eyes that scanned the place as if measuring it. He didn't speak at first, just nodded and took the window seat without asking. The one by the heater, the one everyone used to fight over. Nia picked up her notepad, grabbed a pencil, and walked over, her apron brushing her knees. Welcome, she said, voice warm but cautious. What can I get you? He looked up from his sketchbook. Black coffee, and whatever you recommend. That was the moment something shifted, just slightly, like the first ripple on a still river, and neither of them noticed it. Not yet, but the tide was changing. He came every morning after that. Same table by the window, same order. Black coffee, no sugar, always with that same battered sketchbook and a pencil worn down to a nub. Nia learned his name on the fourth dish, brought over his coffee, and said with a smile, "You're officially a regular now. I should probably know your name before you reach free refill status." He looked up from a half-finished sketch of the riverbank and said, "Evan, just like that. No last name, no over-explaining. Nice to meet you." "Evan," she replied, pouring his refill anyway. The town had noticed him too, in a place where everyone knew everyone's grocery list. A stranger was bound to stir, whispers civil engineer. Someone had muttered at the market studying the river. Another added government sent him to check if the dam's failing. No, he's here to write about the town. Maybe a travel blog. Nia didn't care for rumors, but she did watch. She noticed how he always sat facing the river, how he would sometimes close his eyes as if listening to something in the distance. He scribbled notes, diagrams, and what looked like blueprints on one page. She spotted a delicately drawn suspension bridge spanning from one side of the river to the other. A bridge to nowhere, since both banks now led to empty. "Do you build bridges?" she asked once, trying to sound casual as she wiped the table next to his. He looked up, then back at his page. "Sometimes." Then he added, "Mostly I study water, its patterns, its changes." Nia nodded, though she didn't fully understand. He kept drawing. Later that day, she caught him walking by the docks. He stood still for nearly 15 minutes, staring down into the water, as if waiting for it to speak. He carried a small measuring tool, dipped it in, wrote something down, then walked away without noticing her watching from the cafe window. Her curiosity grew, not the romantic kind, at least not yet. It was the kind of curiosity that comes from quiet routine being disrupted. The kind that sneaks up on you like a sudden breeze after a still day. One evening, while locking up, she saw him again standing by the broken boardwalk, under a flickering streetlight. "You're not from here," she said, more as a statement than a question. "No," he replied, "but I've been to places like this." "Why here?" she asked, voice soft in the silence of the near-empty street. He paused, Something about this river feels tired, like it's forgotten how to move forward. I study that. What stops things? What might make them start again? Struck her more deeply than she expected. Maybe they weren't so different, her and the river. Or even her and Evan, both a little stuck. Both carrying things they didn't talk about. She didn't ask more that night. Just nodded, wished him good night, and walked home. But the next morning, she brewed his coffee 5 minutes early. For the first time in weeks, she caught herself humming softly as she wiped the counter. The truth came out one rainy Tuesday afternoon. It was slow at the cafe, just Nia, an old couple, playing cards near the heater, and Evan, hunched over a folder stuffed with maps, permits, and printed reports. She brought over his usual, set it down quietly, but her eyes lingered on the top sheet feasibility report. Rivertown Ecotourism Initiative. Ah, she said, blinking. So it's official, you're here for work. Evan looked up, not apologetic, but cautious. Yeah, I wasn't trying to hide it, just wasn't ready to explain it all. He slid the folder slightly toward her. You can look, if you want. She did. Maps showing walking trails, kayaking routes, a small visitor center, a bridge connecting both sides of the river, scenic, low impact, sustainable. The document promised words that sounded nice, but felt abstract. Nia sat across from him without asking, why here? He tapped the side of his mug. The river, the potential. This town is beautiful, but it's closed in on itself. Ecotourism could give it a second chance. That's what the city hopes. Nia didn't respond right away. Her mind thinking of the grumbling from the locals when anything new was suggested. Outsiders weren't trusted easily in Rivertown. The next day, the whispers started that city boy wants to tear down the docks. Someone claimed at the barbershop he's gonna pave over the trails, muttered a fisherman. Just another outsider looking to fix us, snapped old Mrs. Durney, who hadn't liked anything new since 1908. For Nia heard it all while serving soup and coffee. Her name got dragged into it. To you're getting cozy with the engineer, huh? This placelle have fancy lattes and no soul. She tried to ignore it, but it stuck. This town had raised her. She owed it everything, but hadn't it also kept her trapped? One evening, she asked Evan directly, are you here to change everything, or save it? He looked at her for a long moment. That depends. Are people here willing to believe in something new? Nia couldn't answer later. She spoke to her father. He sat in his chair by the window, wrapped in a faded shawl, watching the rain slide down the glass. Do you think change is always bad? She asked him. He chuckled. A dry, tired sound. Bad? No. But change is like a river. It cuts new paths, whether we like it or not. People just hate getting their feet wet. That night, she walked by the river alone, coat wrapped tight, closed for years, and imagined it new again. Tourists strolling, children laughing, people returning, but also noise, strangers, loss of what made Rivertown quiet, sacred. slow. She didn't know which future felt heavier the next morning. She found Evan already at the cafe, waiting, a quiet tension in the air. I met with the town board. He said, "It didn't go well." "I'm not surprised," she murmured, sliding him a muffin on the house. "This town doesn't trust easy." He looked at her. "Do you?" She didn't answer, not yet, but she sat down anyway, and for now, that was enough. It started with a rumor, and, like everything in Rivertown, it spread fast. Someone from the city had offered to buy up a chunk of riverside property, not for hiking trails or footbridges, but a resort, a real one-glass walls, infinity pools, a parking lot big enough to eat up half the old docklands. The cafe buzzed with it. Fishermen fumed over black coffee. Teachers whispered about their property taxes rising. Retirees gathered by the gas station, shaking their heads and muttering, "Told you so." And in the middle of it all stood Evan, not the developer. One man snapped at him outside the cafe. "You poked around, made maps, trails, education, conservation, that resort. That's not my project." That's exactly what I was trying to prevent, but it didn't matter. People were angry and fear made them louder than reason. By the weekend, posters had gone up around the town. "Say no to concrete dreams. Save our river. Protect Rivertown. No outsider deals. Boycott Caf Naya." She's with him. That one hurt the most. Naya tore it down herself, hands shaking. Her cafe wasn't just a job, it was the last living part of the Riverside Strip. And now people she'd known since childhood were avoiding her counter, taking their coffee to go, refusing to meet her. Even her father noticed the shift. "You did nothing wrong," he told her, wheezing as he reached for his tea. "People forget their manners when they're scared." Evan had stopped coming in to, whether it was guilt, shame, or just exhaustion, she didn't know. But she missed his sketches on napkins, his quiet nods, the strange comfort of his presence. One afternoon, she found him standing alone near the old bridge, staring at the water. "They're protesting on Saturday," he said quietly. "Marching to the town hall, I heard." She replied, "They think I'm part of that resort deal, and you're not." He looked at her. "If I was, would I be sleeping in a motel with a broken heater and living off bagels?" She snorted. "You could be a very committed villain I'm trying to help in the past, or sell out the future, and you're offering a third?" she asked. "I was trying to, that night." Nia found herself pacing the cafe kitchen long after closing. Something had to be done. A line had to be drawn, but carefully. This wasn't just a fight between old and new. It was about how they changed, and who got to decide so. She opened her laptop, drafted a flyer of her own town meeting. Real plans, real voices. "Let's talk before we burn the bridge." She printed 20 copies, posted them in places no one had touched yet. The church notice board, the post office window, even by the pier end. When she taped the last one to the cafe door, she stood back and whispered, "If this goes wrong, doing something that mattered." It started with a warning. a radio crackle at dawn, heavy rainfall upstream. Residents near the riverbank should prepare for possible flooding. Rivertown was used to the river acting up once in a while, but never like Dispy noon. The rain hadn't stopped. It poured with a kind of fury that rattled window panes and drowned the sound of conversation. Naya stood behind the cafe counter, hands clenching a towel as she watched water gather outside the door, inch by inch. The street became a shallow stream. Her phone buzzed with alerts. Flash flood warning. Evacuate low-lying areas. Town hall shelter open. She bolted to the back room and called her dad. No answer. Again. Voicemail. Her heart thudded. He was still home. Alone, she grabbed her coat, keys, and flashlight. By the time she stepped outside, the street was a river ankle deep and rising. Where are you going? A voice called. She turned. Evan stood on the cafe porch, soaked and panting, a waterproof bag strapped to his back. You can't drive through this. My dad's home. He hasn't picked up, she shouted over the Rainovan. Didn't hesitate. I'll come with you. They waded through water and debris, the current pushing harder with every step. The riverside no longer looked like home. It was a blur of gray and brown, with trash bins floating past and garden chairs flipped upside down by the time they reached her street. The water was knee-deep. The door to her house stuck when she tried it. Move, Evan said, and kicked it open inside. It was worse. The lower floor was already flooded. She called out, voice cracking. Baba, Baba, where are you? A faint cough answered from upstairs. Relief surged. They found him slumped on the bed, blankets soaked at the ends, a faint fever in his eyes. Didn't hear the phone, he mumbled, was asleep. Evan helped him onto his feet, while Nia wrapped him in a dry shawl. They moved fast, careful not to slip on the wet stairs outside. Water licked at the edge of the porch. I know a back route to the town hall, Evan said. Old railway path, slightly elevated. Nia nodded. No time for questions together. They guided her father down the flooded streets. A few other neighbors had come out too, huddling under umbrellas, helping each other. Evan stopped to lift a woman's dog out of a crate floating away. He lent his flashlight to a man guiding two kids. By the time they reached the shelter, soaked and shivering, people looked at Evan differently. That engineer guy saved my niece. Someone said he helped carry Mrs. Fennick's oxygen tank. He's not with those resort jerks. He's one of the good ones. Nia watched silently as Evan stood in the corner, dripping water onto the linoleum floor, refusing blankets until others were taken care of. First, she handed him a cup of hot tea. You okay? She asked. He gave a tired smile. More or less. Your dad's settled in? Yeah, he asked. If you're single, Evan laughed, and for a moment, the chaos around them quieted that night. As the storm finally slowed, something shifted, not just in the river or in the town's trust, but in the space between them. It wasn't just survival. It was connection, and Rivertown had seen it. The rain had stopped. For days, Rivertown smelled like mud and damp wood. Roads were streaked with silt, fallen branches lined the riverbank, and shop fronts bore watermarks like bruises. But amidst the wreckage, something else had taken root movement. Nia stood outside the cafe, broom in hand, sweeping the warped floorboards clean of dried leaves and bits of gravel. The sign had fallen, the chairs were ruined, and the pastry counter needed replacing. But the building stood, and that was enough to begin. Evan didn't leave, technically. His evaluation work was done, but he canceled his return ticket, saying something vague about needing more time. Truth was, people had started waving at him on the street. A few even asked for his advice on repairs. The man who once sat quietly in a corner booth had somehow become the one hammering wooden planks outside the town hall. Every morning, he helped locals rebuild patching rooftops, checking the bridge's foundation, handing out sandbags for future precautions. Naya often found him by the river after sundown, sketchbook in hand, drawing new layouts for riverside paths. I'm thinking trails, bike rentals, maybe even a kayak launch, he told her one evening, but built by locals, owned by locals, no corporate nonsense. It made her smile. You're turning into one of us. I think I like it, he said. Eyes soft, Naya too found her fire again. She organized a river cleanup, putting up hand-painted signs on corkboards and cafe windows. Help heal our river this Sunday. Gloves, buckets, snacks provided. Dozens showed up. Teenagers who once complained about the boring town. Elderly folks with stories about how the river used to be, and even grumpy Mr. Parlin from the hardware store. Together, they hauled out tires, plastic bottles, even an old scooter buried in the mud. 2 weeks later, she announced a pop-up Riverside Festival. Riverlight, music, story sand art by the water. The cafe reopened just in time, no longer just a coffee stop. It became a gathering place. Naya brought in local artists to paint the wall swirls of blue, golden sunbursts, scenes of river life. A corner was turned into a tiny library, with shelves donated by townsfolk. She hung fairy lights and stacked board games near the windows. Every Saturday night, people gathered for river stories, where kids read poems, elders told folktales, and musicians played under flickering lanterns. Evan, despite his quiet nature, read once too an essay about bridges, both literal and metaphorical, that night. As the lights reflected in the river and laughter echoed off the banks, Naya realized something had changed, not just in Rivertown, but in herself. This wasn't just rebuilding walls or repainting signs. It was rebuilding belonging, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't just dreaming of more, she was living it. The river hadn't changed. Its currents still whispered along the banks, winding their old familiar paths, rippling past reeds and skipping over stones. It rose and fell with the seasons, wild in spring, gentle by autumn. But the town was different now. There was color again. not just in the murals that bloomed across crumbling walls or the flower beds outside the post office, but in the way people spoke. There was laughter at the grocer's, music drifting through windows, and kids biking past the river with kites trailing behind. A quiet hope had settled in the air, soft but unmistakable, and at the center of it all stood the Low Tide Café. The little cafe that once struggled to stay open was now filled with light and chatter. Nia had painted the doorway a deep teal, hung wind chimes outside, and strung lanterns from the trees in the back garden where she now served tea beneath the stars. Locals didn't just come for coffee anymore, they came to feel home. Even tourists had started trickling in, bloggers looking for hidden gems, artists inspired by the community spirit, and nature lovers drawn by the new river trails Evan had helped design. His blueprints had been approved, but instead of rushing back to the city, he stayed. He'd rented a small house near the river, quiet, old, and a little crooked, just like he liked it. Every morning he stopped by the cafe, still ordering the same cinnamon coffee, and every evening he helped with whatever Nia needed, sometimes moving crates, sometimes fixing lights, and sometimes just standing beside her when things got busy. His sketchbook was always near, filled with both bridge diagrams and half-finished doodles of cafe chairs and ferry lights. And Nia, for the first time in years, she didn't feel stuck. She felt rooted. She started a writing club on Wednesdays, a storytelling hour for kids on Sundays, and even organized a floating lantern night on the river during the first full moon of the season. The town showed up with glowing jars and whispered wishes. Even old Mr. Finch, who hadn't left his house in months, was there, his lantern sailing slow and steady down the river's current. But just when everything seemed to settle, a letter arrived, stamped in bold from the city council, addressed to Evan. Nia found him sitting by the river that evening, the unopened envelope beside him. He looked more serious than usual, his brows furrowed. "It's a job offer," he said quietly. "Director of River Development in the capital, double pay, prestige, everything." Her heart paused, and he looked at her. "I haven't said yes." She blinked. "Why not?" He smiled, a little sad, a little soft. "Because the city never felt like something to build a life in, just something to survive in. But this place made me want to stay." She sat beside him, their shoulders barely touching, watching the lanterns from last night float further downstream. "But," he added, "I also don't want to stay here just for someone else's dream." Nia looked at him. "Then let's build a new one together." And just like that, the twist turned into a beginning. In the months that followed, Evan turned down the job, but instead of staying at the cafe forever, he and Nia started a side project, a river education center inside a restored boathouse. Schools came on field trips. Visitors learned about the local wildlife, clean water, and eco-building. The cafe stayed the heart, but now it had veins flowing outward into art, into education, into action. The river didn't change, but they did, and maybe that was the point. Sometimes you don't need to go anywhere to find something new. Sometimes you just need to open your eyes, take a breath, and notice how lifelike water flows forward anyway. The final shot of this chapter, a golden morning. Nia flips the cafe sign to open. Evan places a lantern-shaped sugar jar on the counter, and the town wakes again with coffee, light, and a new kind of hope. End.